unusual for this class, but you guys should be focusing right now on getting that chapter quiz done. And I know 4 of you already have, so good job. The rest of you still need to work on that. It is due Friday at midnight. Does anyone have any questions about that quiz? No. Okay. All right, so today, instead of doing chapters 5 and 6, we're only going to do chapter 5. And if you looked at it in the book, you might have noticed it's only about 3 pages long. So it's a really short chapter, which is all about how art critics evaluate art. I know my 9:30 class is really interested in this subject as to like what specifically makes an art piece successful or not successful in the eyes of an art critic. Art critics in turn will determine whether or not your art is going to be worth a lot of money. Art critics are the people that write reviews about art shows. If they go to your art show and write that your artwork is horrible, people will probably not invest money in your art. If an art critic goes to your show and says your artwork is amazing, groundbreaking, and a wonderful addition to the art world or something like that, then people are probably going to want to buy your art. And then, of course, the idea of supply and demand will drive the prices of the market for your art. But there's 3 specific ways that art critics will evaluate your art when they're going to these art shows, which is kind of a good topic today since that's what your big assignment's about, is evaluating an art show. So to get us started with chapter 5, we're going to start by going over those 3 different ways that critics will evaluate art and then go over some examples of how they've done it in the past. So art criticism is just the job of making judgments, both good and bad, for art. That word judgment gets a negative connotation a lot of times, but judgments can also be positive. And people really do go to school to become art critics. And then, of course, the 3 ways that art critics will evaluate art are formal, contextual, and expressive. Formal theory is one in which the art critic will use art history to evaluate the art. So how was this artwork influenced by previous artworks? Contextual theory is when an art critic will evaluate an art piece based on the culture that it came from or the culture that it represents. For example, over the last few months, there's been a lot of artists that are making Black Lives Matter artworks to represent that particular cultural movement that happened. So art critics have been evaluating those based on contextual theory. And then, of course, the 3rd way art critics evaluate art is expressive. How well was this artist able to express themselves through their artwork? Did they succeed? Did they not succeed? So we're going to start off with formal theory, look at some examples of that and how it works, or at least the basic idea of how it works, and then move into the other 2. Starting with formal theory, once again, that has to do with art history and how that artwork was influenced by previous art trends. And a great way to look at that is through the history of the female nude. For some reason, whatever reason, throughout forever, since prehistoric era, people have been making images of female nudes. We'll be looking at some when we go through our art history textbook. You'll come across The Woman of Willendorf, who was made 35,000 BCE. So they've been around for a really, really long time. But that is a great way to understand how an art critic might evaluate art. So in this video, it's going to show two different reclining female nudes, reclining just means laying down, and the way in which art critics went about evaluating them and determining whether or not they were successful.
There's a long tradition of the female nude represented in the most erotic, sensuous way, clothed by mythology or clothed by sheer beauty.
It's a tradition that goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans in sculptures, for example, of the goddess Venus modestly covering her body after her bath. And Manet, in this painting that we're looking at here at the Musée d'Orsay, is clearly drawing on those traditions, but doing something radically modern.
The immediate model for Manet was Titian's Venus of Urbino, except that he stripped.
So right here, you can already see that Manet copied Titian's work. Manet's, of course, being done in the 1800s and Titian's in the Renaissance era in the 1500s. So Manet has already pulled directly from art history. You see that happen with a lot of artists. They'll be inspired by a previous work and want to put their own spin on it. When that happens, there's comparisons that are bound to be made between the two pieces, which is exactly what happened with Manet's Olympia and Titian's Venus.
Stripping away the academic technique of the representation of space, of the turn of the body, but he's also stripping away that veil of mythology.
And here at the Musée d'Orsay, we can see traditional nudes as Venus painted in a traditional way. Clearly, the images that Manet's Olympia is speaking to.
So by academic art, we're talking about the kind of art that was sanctioned by the official academy that was associated with the government of France.
It didn't challenge particularly, it satisfied.
Well, for a couple of reasons. For one, because it had the stamp of the official state. These were the leading artists of the time. They were saying this art is of quality. And so, of course, it had ready market value. But at the same time, it was art that was formulaic, that was expected.
Well, there was an idea that there was a definition of great art. And there was no point in looking for what was new or different, because what great art was self-evident. Great art was based on the classical and the Renaissance. And what someone like Manet is doing is...
So what they were talking about just then was how art was critiqued in the 1800s when this painting was made. It was something called the Academy that decided whether or not your art was going to be successful. Now we have art critics that write in newspapers and blogs instead. But this academy had a set of rules that artists were expected to follow. If they followed those rules, then they were set to be successful and make a lot of money. If they didn't follow those rules, which is what Manet chose to do, then they would be kicked out of the academy and have a hard time selling art. And now it's going to go into why Manet's Olympia was rejected. But I think you could probably already tell just by looking at the two paintings side by side, possibly why Manet's was not welcomed, whereas Titian's was well respected.
Challenging those very established ideas that seemed as natural as the sun coming up in the morning. She's not a Venus. Her name is Olympia, and she looks very much like a real woman in a real apartment in Paris.
So wait a minute, so how do you know she looks like a real woman as opposed to a Venus. We don't know what a Venus looks like.
Her features are not idealized. They're not perfected. When we look at ancient Greek sculpture or Renaissance paintings of the nude, we have a woman who's perfectly beautiful, and you can see her face is asymmetrical, and her lips are a little bit too thin. She doesn't have that perfection.
In addition, the representations of the academic artists always show Venus or other nudes in a coy way. This woman is looking directly at us. She is sentient, she is thinking, and she's confronting us even as we look at her.
And so there was a real problem, I think, for the viewers of this painting. There's no way to look at her and pretend that it was about beauty. One was confronted by her sexuality. There was no way to say, I'm just looking at the ideal image of Venus, of the idea of beauty, of here the reality of a nude woman is present.
And it's even coarser than that, because this woman was recognized as a courtesan, that is, as a kind of prostitute.
The name Olympia was common for prostitutes at that time in Paris.
And what we're seeing here is Olympia's servant handing her flowers that presumably have just come from one of her patrons, one of her customers. We must have, as the customer, walked into the room and startled the cat at the foot of the bed, as well as the two figures. And so there is this vulgarity here. It really is doing even more than just stripping away the mythology. It's confronting 19th century Paris with its own corruption.
When we use the word prostitute, we think of a figure of much lower class, and here we have a woman who's obviously a higher class prostitute.
The reaction of the press was pretty vicious.
The press said she looked like a cadaver. She looked like she was dead. Manet outlined her in wax and hardly modeled her flesh.
What's interesting is that some of the caricatures that were made of this emphasize the shadow on her hands and feet, and some of the press actually spoke of her hands being filthy. And it's interesting that those are the only areas where there's significant modeling.
Where one would expect to see modeling on the female nude would be in the abdomen or on the breasts. And here Manet's kept that really flat. And you're right, the areas that we do see shadow are unexpected. So the press interpreted her hand as drawing attention to her sexuality, even though nudes for centuries had shown women with their hand placed across their genitals.
You mentioned the kind of flatness of her body, and some art historians even said she's a bit of a paper cutout. Manet, of course, in so much of his work, really does reject the clear articulation of represented space and confronts the viewer with the complexity of painting on a two-dimensional surface. And an area where you can really see that are, for instance, in the way the toes peek out from under her slipper. There is this awkwardness that reminds us that all of this is illusion, and that in fact there is just this two-dimensionality of this canvas.
It's a kind of unmasking. Manet is saying, I'm not going to pretend that my painting isn't paint. I'm not going to present you with this perfect illusion, the way that academic artists are doing, where you don't even see a brushstroke. So he's insisting on unmasking that illusion. And then he's insisting on unmasking the illusion of our own interests in looking at these images. He's reminding us that our interest here is a sexual one.
Right, in so many traditional representations of the nude, because the figure is not looking out at us, we can comfortably look at her. But here we're confronted by her gaze and by her thinking, and there is a much more problematic experience here.
And that's in the fact that she's a real woman, she's contemporary, and the way she picks her head up, the way she looks out at us, the angularity of her body, it's in all those things.
Okay, so you can understand there's a long laundry list there of reasons why art critics did not appreciate Manet's Olympia. And even in this video, they compared Manet's Olympia to many different female nudes that had already existed. And that's exactly what that formal theory of art does. It's when art critics will compare your artwork to previously made artworks to determine whether or not it is better than those, or at least aligns with those. Unfortunately for Manet's Olympia and the time it was made, people did not appreciate it. Nowadays, Manet is like considered a genius because he was trying new things and pushing the limit on what he could do. But back then, he got in so much trouble for his art that he was not allowed to show in galleries. If you can't show in galleries as an artist, you're not going to make money. So it was not good news for him at the time, because he chose to show things flatly without dimension. And he confronted viewers with almost all of his artworks in an uncomfortable manner that people did not appreciate, which is what this artwork's all about. So you saw a great example there of how formal theory would work in the art world, with the study of the female nude. And now we're going to move on from formal theory to contextual theory. Contextual theory is not quite as deep. You don't have to have like a ton of background and knowledge for this one, like you do the previous one. To properly do formal theory, you have to have a good fair amount of understanding of art history. For contextual, you just have to understand what's happening in the environment when that artwork was made. Contextual theory is basically the product of the culture. A great example of that is the work of Dada artists. Dada artists came about during World War I. And if you're familiar with World War I, it's the first world war, the first war on a grand scale. People were afraid, confused, frustrated that was happening. And almost everyone thought it was going to be the war to end all wars. Of course, they were wrong. We know better now. But Dada art was created as a reaction to World War I. These artists were irritated with the fact that the government insisted on war instead of trying to talk and reach agreements. So they felt the war itself was very absurd. As a result, they made artwork that was very absurd and bizarre and strange as a reaction to their feelings towards World War I. If you remember our fur teacup from the texture section by Merritt Oppenheim, that is a Dada work of art. And here is yet another Dada artist. This is Hannah Hawks, cut with the kitchen knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany. This is the longest title that we have in this class. And it is a collage. Collage is just a combination of different images pasted together. This collage has the word Dada all over it, as well as images of men standing next to their machines. If you're familiar with World War I, they also used a lot of new inventions to fight those battles, like airplanes and machine guns. So kind of a big deal for that time period. I'm going to look up one more, because there's a really good one. Here's another Dada work of art. It's a iron that's got thumbtacks glued to it. It's bizarre, it's absurd, which was exactly what they were trying to make a comment on with that First World War. So a great way to evaluate artworks that are trying to be reactionary to the times they were made in is by using that contextual art theory. You could also even apply formal and contextual together with Manet's Olympia. He was trying to be reactionary with academic art that was being created, if you really want to. That takes us to the third theory, the easiest one to understand, and that's expressive. Expressive theory is all about the question of, did the artist do a good job expressing themselves? Yes or no? Of course, all of these theories are very opinion-based, and this one is extremely opinion-based on whether or not you think someone does a good job of expressing themselves. And here we have a bit of an artwork that is extremely controversial. This is Andres Serrano's picture. This is a photograph. This artwork was actually censored. But for this piece, Serrano was trying to express his feelings on modern day Christians. It was not a positive view. Once again, this artwork was censored. Does anyone know what the word censorship means or what it means to censor something? Yeah, so it's usually covered, removed, kept separate. Sometimes art galleries will put warnings on art shows that might be too graphic for audiences before you enter them, so that you at least know what you're walking into. That way they aren't liable for anything. Artists like to push the boundaries with present day topics. There's a lot of artists that are making artworks on drug violence, gang violence, police violence, and they're quite graphic scenes. There's also artists that make artworks trying to make statements on pedophiles and rape. Those are not easy to digest images. They're very graphic. So things like that tend to be censored by museums and galleries, and there's oftentimes warnings that come along with them before you go see them. Or what could happen to them would be what happened to this one. So this particular artwork ended up being taken down just a day after it was put up because people were so angered by it. In fact, it was later broken and Serrano had to make a new one of it. Once again, this is a photograph. But why do you think this might have angered people to the point that they had to remove it and people broke it? Well, it has to do with the title and what it actually is. So this artwork is a photograph of a rosary that was taken in a glass of the artist's own urine. So just the photograph itself does not look menacing, but when you understand what it actually is, it's quite offensive to a lot of people. But as I mentioned earlier, the artist was trying to express his viewpoints on modern day Christians, not Christianity, but Christians. He himself felt that Christians were not respectful of their own religion or representative of Christ the way they should be. Basically, he was saying they were pissing on their own religion. And that was how he chose to express his feelings. Most art critics agree he did a really good job at expressing those feelings, but because the public was so outraged with the concept of the artwork, it was censored and most people didn't even have the opportunity to understand why it was censored or what was even happening. It wasn't until a great time later that Serrano was actually able to make a comment about why he did this art piece and what it actually represented for him. And then, of course, after doing so, people were a lot more receptive of what the artwork actually is. But Serrano himself is a bit of a rebel when it comes to the art world with the particular topics that he does. Your art book mentions Chris O'Feely's Virgin Mary. That's another artwork that offended a lot of people because it has elephant dung on it. It's a painting of the Virgin Mary with elephant dung. But in Chris O'Feely's original African culture, elephant dung is sacred. So to him, it made sense to add it to a painting of Mary. But to Western culture, it didn't really make sense. So oftentimes with censorship, it does take a little bit of a connotation from the artist to really understand why they made the artwork before people will actually accept it. And of course, with expressive theory, it's also important to understand why the artist actually made that art piece. And then you can determine whether or not they were successful at conveying their emotions. And those are actually the three theories, formal, contextual, and expressive. And I would like for you to keep in mind those three theories as we are about to go over a big assignment, which is all about writing a gallery review. As I mentioned earlier, critics will go to galleries and write a review using those three theories on what they thought about that art show, whether or not it was successful. And oftentimes what they write will determine the sales of the artist. So it is a rather important concept that exists today. Let me get people marked in before we move on. So if you go to, actually, I'll just go straight to modules and I'll turn it to student view so it looks exactly the same. If you go to your modules page in Canvas and you scroll down to the module that says gallery review, you'll notice a lecture on how to do it in case you forget by the time you want to start writing it. It's a little recap lesson there. The gallery report itself, which is due February 5th, which isn't too far away. So I want to go ahead and get you guys started. And virtual exhibition options. If you don't want to go to one in person, you can do a virtual one. But first, let's introduce the actual assignment. So the assignment itself, you guys are going to be writing your own review of a gallery show. Of course, in this course, I like your papers to be double spaced just because it's easier for me to make annotations on them if I need to. 12-point font and preferably something legible. And your paper should be 400 to 1,000 words. 400 is the bare minimum. That does not guarantee an A. That's just the bare minimum. And I used to not have a limit on length, but last semester I had someone write a 10-page paper and I don't have time to read that. So now there's a limit on the length. But yeah, if you use outside sources, which by all means do if you want to, please cite them in MLA format. If you don't know how to cite an MLA, that's also on your modules page at the very top. And of course, if you use a picture of the artwork, you need to label that artwork. It's the same way your book labels it. So, of course, include an introduction. I used to not put that in there, but people don't realize that papers should have introductions unless you write that it needs an introduction. All papers should have introductions. It doesn't matter whether or not the professor specifies it if it needs an introduction. All papers should have introductions. Yeah, and then your introduction should lead into part one. Part one is to identify the exhibit. So tell me about the overall gallery. What were the mediums shown in the art show? Who were the artists shown in that art show? What was the theme? Almost every single gallery show will have some sort of a theme included with it. And that is a great section to discuss whether or not that theme works with the art that was shown. We're actually going to be going on a little trip in a second to the art gallery across the way. So you get an understanding of looking for themes and commonalities between artworks and whether or not they work. Other things that you can look at is whether or not you personally liked the exhibit. Don't just say, I like this exhibit. Tell me why you like the exhibit. Elaborate. Elaboration is always good. In art papers, adjectives are always welcome. We like descriptive words in art. It's a wonderful thing. You can refer to yourself in this paper. You can write using I, which is a rarity also in college. You don't come across that too often. what value did this exhibit have for you personally? Did you connect with it on a deeper level? If so, how? And then in part 2, you will select one artwork from all of the works shown in that gallery and analyze that one art piece. You can analyze it using the previous 2 chapters materials that we talked about: colors, lines, shapes, composition, and the principles of design. You can also analyze it using those art critic theories that we just talked about. It just depends on you. Some questions that you can use, but you don't have to use. These are just in case you need help coming up with stuff to write about. Who is the artist and the title of the piece? That's always a good one to include. What's the medium? Is it 2D, 3D? Describe what you see. Tell me what's happening in that picture or painting or sculpture. Was it well executed? Does it do a good job of conveying the message that it's trying to convey? And then, of course, is there a theme or message? And explain why you chose that artwork. Did you connect with it on a deeper level? And then, of course, a conclusion. If outside sources are used, you should include a works cited page at the bottom. And then, of course, how you can label your page. All of your pages should be submitted through Canvas by February 5th. And then, of course, how your paper will be graded. There's a little rubric attached. It's just your basic rubric on how people grade papers. Of course, an A paper should be free of spelling, punctuation, and grammar errors. Last semester, once again, my last semester class was like a bit of an odd one. I've never had so many issues before, but they were very surprised when they didn't receive an A and they had a bunch of punctuation and grammar errors in their paper. I can't give you an A if you're writing with fragment and run-on sentences. It just doesn't work like that. Plus, it's hard for me to read, and I don't like struggling to read a paper. Of course, it should also use proper art terminology and skillfully present the significance of the art piece and the assignment guidelines that I just went over. And that would be an A. It's not hard to get an A. It's really not. I make it sound really hard, but I'm a stickler for grammar and punctuation, as well as whether or not it's an interesting paper. If you're starting off your paper of, I chose this, it's not a good way to start a paper. It doesn't get me interested in reading it. We have moved past that level in college. We are now writing with a lot more purpose and intention, rather than just trying to complete requirements. And of course, if you're wanting help or you even want me to proofread your paper, I don't mind doing it, but you got to give me enough advance notice. Now, questions about how to do the gallery report or about it as well. Okay, then I'm going to move on to if you choose to do a virtual option. There's a list of different websites that have virtual galleries here. You just have to click on the gallery. It'll take you to that page, and there's a whole tour as well as some information. That's if you choose to do a virtual gallery, and it's like that for all of these. You just have to pick which one you want. But you can also do a gallery in person. And today, like I said, for the last bit of class, we're going to be going over to the art gallery and looking at their art show that they've got on display right now, which is by a Mexican-American artist, and it's almost entirely drawings. Oftentimes, the art shows that we have here are student exhibitions. This one is not a student exhibition, and usually we have a combination of different mediums used, but this one is pretty much all drawings, and it's pretty rare for a gallery to put on a show with just drawings. But yeah, so what we're going to do next is, if there's no questions, we're going to go across the way and look at some art. You can bring your stuff with you. or you can leave it here. But as soon as you're done looking at the art show, you are free to go for the day. Tomorrow, we're going to go over drawing. It's going to be another short lesson. So yay.